Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Ayin Chet. Today's daf is sponsored by David and Mitzi Geffen in loving memory of Mitzi's brother Jerry Locke on his 6th year at site. He was the first in the family to make Aliyah to Israel, was a loving husband, father, grandfather, uncle, and brother who is sorely missed. Today's daf is sponsored by Devorah Lopez in loving memory of her father, David Barg. David Wolf ben Esther Yitzchak Zichrono Livracha on his 26th year at site yesterday. He believed in giving his children the best education possible and a love of Israel and family. Today's daf is sponsored by the ladies who daf Upper East Side in honor of Erica Schwartz's milestone birthday. May the light of your learning continue to shine brightly through the month of Kislev and the remainder of the year, inspiring all of those around you. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started. I will correct or just clarify one thing. Yesterday in Dugan Shaba'ayim, when I mentioned there was a difference of opinion and one possibility related to the cornea, what I meant was a problem, an issue with the cornea, not there is a cornea, but that wasn't clear. It was specifically to say there was a problem with the cornea. Again, there's different interpretations what exactly the blemish is. Okay, we'll get started now with our Mishnah. We'll go back to the beginning of the Mishnah and we'll really delve into this Mishnah today. Dam shenit arev b'mayim. So we have blood that gets mixed up with water. Im yesh bo mar'itam kasher. This is, by the way, I want to just clarify because there's a little bit of a confusion, not confusion, this could lead a little to confusion here for everybody because normally when we talk about bitul, we want to know is an isser, right, batel and a heter, is it nullified within a, like classic, milk in a chulent, right? Is the milk nullified in the chulent? But here we're talking about, is the blood still in existence enough to be able to say we can bring this blood on the altar? It's a different, it's the other perspective. It's not, right? Do we have to say, oh, you can taste the milk, so it's not nullified? Okay, we're going to, by the way, we're going to compare, we're going to assume these are the same, taste and look. Okay, so these are just some things that are helpful to have in the back of your head. Number one, let's start with that really. Taste and look are similar in the sense that you might have dine bitul barov, okay, things are nullified in a majority, but if you can taste it, or if you can see it, you can see how those two things are the same, then it's not nullified. Now, nullified, and then we jump to what I started with, which is if it can be if it can't be nullified, then normally that means it's prohibited. Here, if it can't be nullified, it means you can actually bring it on the altar. It's the other side of things, right? It's not saying it's a problem, it's saying it's good. So it's a little confusing because we're using similar ideas about nullification, but nullification has sometimes ramifications in a positive sense. If it's not nullified, then you could still bring it on the altar. That's just things to keep in your head as we go through. I'm going to remind you, which is going to come up later today, that when we talk of laws of nullification, we dealt with this a lot in different sugyot and especially more recently in Avodah Zarah. We have this concept of min b'mino, two things that are similar, and min b'she'eno mino, two things that are different. So we're going to talk about that also. And maybe already if we're here, what's the issue with min b'mino in general? When two things are the same, there's no ta'am really, right? Because the taste is the same. So it's not like you could say, I could taste the isser, two pieces of meat, right? So you can't taste the isur of the problematic meat because we assume the taste is the same. It's not like it's giving flavor to the other piece. So we're going to talk about that also, about things that are similar. And by the way, when it comes to look, theoretically, and that's what's a little strange about this Mishnah, we would say that's min b'mino because they look the same, right? Red wine, blood, or blood that goes on the altar versus blood that doesn't go on the altar. So you would think that that would be classic min b'mino, which, right, the whole thing of the look is irrelevant, okay? So we'll talk about all this as we go through our daf. These things are just helpful to keep in your head. So dam shenit arev b'mayim. So first we have two different things that generally, right, we would say. So im yesh bo mar'it dam kasher. If it looks like blood, then you can still use it. So you can have a lot of water. If it's still reddish, now they don't really tell you what shade of red you need it to be, okay? But whatever the shade is, if we say it looks like blood, then it's kasher. Obviously, practically, it's very hard to know how you implement this because it's hard to know what they mean by it looks like blood. Okay, but that's a point we're not going to deal with today. Nit arev b'yayin, ro'ino to ki'ilu humayim, or nit arev b'dam be'ema or b'dam chaya, ro'ino to ki'ilu hemayim. So if it mixes with a similar color substance, whether it's blood that's not meant for the altar or it's wine, red wine obviously, then we do an assessment. we say, well, were this to be water, would it still look like blood? If so, you can do it. If not, not. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and he says, Ein dam mevatel dam. Blood is not mevatel other blood, which generally we would think that means prohibitive, right? It's a problem. No, it's actually good here, because it means that if blood is mixed in with this blood from the altar, even if had it been water, it would look like water. Doesn't matter. As long as you have one drop of blood in there, it's never nullified. Where does he get this from? The dama par and the dama seir. This is the whole source, really, for the whole min b'mino. That it's different, and that because in Yom Kippur, if you remember, it talks about the Kohen takes the dam apar and the dama seir, and it still calls it. He mixes them together, and they still call it the dam of the par and the dam of the seir. They don't lose their identity in this mixture, even though there's obviously way more blood from the bull than there is from the goat, and blood doesn't mevatel dam, so therefore even a little drop of blood is in here. Now obviously you would have to pour all the blood on the altar, because you have to make sure that drop of blood gets poured, but you could use it. Nit arev b'dam psulim. However, in a case where, now it's not clear whose opinion this is, and it's not clear, and we're going to see Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, it's not clear which case he disagrees about, because there's two cases here. We'll get to all that in the Gemara later. But if it mixes with blood that's disqualified blood, okay? Until now we had just regular blood or wine, but what if it's something that's not allowed on the altar, like the blood of an animal that engaged in bestiality, as Rashi brings as an example? So then the blood has to be spilled, because it has disqualified blood that's not allowed to go on the altar, so you spill the blood in the amah. If you remember, there was that channel on the floor, like a little area where you pour things, it would stream out from there to the Kidron stream, Nachal Kidron. Or b'damatamtzit. If it gets mixed up with the blood, what's damatamtzit? That's the blood that comes from the inside of the animal, not the blood that spurts out from the shechita, which is the blood that's supposed to go, but the blood from the inside. Apparently, seems like it's almost as disqualified as the rovea v'nirba, as the bestiality animal. Also, yishafech lama. You can't use that blood on the altar, so it gets poured in the amah. Rabbi Eliezer machshir. So now, whether he's machshir only in damatamtzit, because you could see you could distinguish between those two cases, or maybe he's disagreeing about both, and he permits this mixture. Again, more of that we get to the Gemara later, not today. Im lo nimlach v'natan, but however, if this blood was mixed with problematic blood, and anyway, the Kohen didn't ask, just put it on the altar. This seems to be a favorite line, im lo nimlach. If he didn't ask, right? He didn't ask a shaila, he just did what he wanted. Right? We saw it with the birds, we saw it in a bunch of cases, then it's kasher. Okay, actually the blood for the sacrifice you needed was on the altar, and it works. So the first thing we're going to do two things with this Mishnah today. The first thing we're going to do is a very short sugya. We're going to narrow a little bit the case in the Mishnah. We're going to do a lo shanu ela. Lo shanu ela means the Mishnah wasn't taught shanu milashon Mishnah. Okay, right? It's the teaching of the Mishnah. We don't teach this Mishnah except in a case of this. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo shanu ela shenaflu mayim letoch dam. And now we're going to get really back to a sugya we learned in Avodah Zarah. If the water fell into the blood, then we go by what we said. It all goes by whether it looks like blood or doesn't look like blood. Aval nafal dam litoch mayim. If the blood falls into the water, and now we're going to assume not all at once, but if it starts streaming into it in a stream and not all in one fell swoop, rishon batel. You might remember this. We had this with wine, yenesech. Every drop that falls in to the water at that point, right? As one drop enters the water, there's rove of water, obviously, at that point, because there's water underneath. A drop of wine gets in, it's immediately nullified. Next drop comes in, immediately nullified. And we keep going. Even if in the end, the amount of blood becomes the majority, because in the end, you poured a lot of it in. But already, what happened here, and this is a law we're going to say in a minute, it's specifically for kodshim. So even if you end up with a majority of blood, and it looks like blood, and the majority is blood, you can't bring it on the altar. Why? Because of the halacha of dichoy. If you remember, the rejection law. Something is rejected for the altar, it can't return to be accepted, because it's a reject. Like we talked about leftovers or something. It's been rejected. Well, something rejected, we don't want to bring on the altar. It's disgrace to God. So when the blood, each drop of blood hits the water, it's immediately nullified. Now in the end, we could say, now this is in laws of kashrut, we call this chozer v'ne'or. So something could theoretically keep dropping in, and it's nullified. But if in the end you end up with a lot of it, you say chozer v'ne'or. It reawakens, okay, ne'or, like to wake up. It reawakens and it comes back to life. So the blood was nullified. Once there's enough of an amount, you would theoretically say it's chozer v'ne'or and it comes back to being blood. But in this case, even if we would say it comes back to being blood, it's not blood that can be accepted on the altar because it was already rejected. At the earlier stages, when the blood kept going in, all that blood became rejected, so we can't bring it on the altar. And Rav Papa then points out, Rav Papa, le'inyan kisoy enoken, lefi she'ein dichoy b'mitzvot. There's no concept of dichoy in mitzvot. Dichoy is only a concept in kodshim. It's only things you're bringing directly to God, even though a mitzvah is also related to God, but not in the same way as bringing offerings to God in the Beit HaMikdash. So if you're bringing offerings, you can't bring offerings from rejected items. But if you have to fulfill a mitzvah, like kisoy hadam, so what's that? If I slaughter an animal, not in the temple, I slaughter an animal, I have to cover the blood in the ground. It's called kisoy hadam. Now, if the blood from the animal that I slaughtered got spilled into water, and we would say theoretically rishon batel, and therefore every time it spilled, it got nullified into the water, and this is just a combination of water. But their chozer v'ne'or would be relevant, that if in the end I have a majority of blood, I would have to cover this blood because the blood comes back. And we don't use this issue of rejection. Rejection is not relevant for mitzvot. Okay, so that's one point. So the first point we did about this Mishnah is we narrowed, again, we're really talking about the first case of the Mishnah right now. Everything we learned yesterday, that's going to be the focus of our Mishnah for today, and the focus of the Gemara on that part of the Mishnah. First thing we did, we narrowed it down to say, well, this actually is only talking about blood, water that fell into blood. But if it's the opposite, that wouldn't be true. Now we're going to leave our sugya for a few minutes, go into a statement of Rish Lakish. Further in the sugya, we're going to have a difficulty that they're going to raise from our Mishnah on something that the Gemara says, based on their understanding of Rish Lakish, and we're going to have a difficulty from our Mishnah. So put our Mishnah aside, and we're going to go into a completely different sugya. But obviously it has to do with laws of nullification, so we'll see. Amar Rish Lakish. Hapigul v'hanotar v'hatameh. Rashi actually doesn't have a tameh. It doesn't really matter, but let's just assume it's pigul and notar. It's easier to talk about a case with two items. So you have, now we're going to assume, the Gemara is going to assume, or Rashi kind of tells us this, but it's going to be obvious. The Gemara is going to assume, and I'll tell you right now, that we're talking about a piece of, let's say, meat that was pigul, and a meal offering that was notar, where we have two different substances. Min b'she'eno mino, two different substances. Why is that relevant? Because we're going to talk about ta'am, taste. As I mentioned in the beginning of the daf, the beginning of the shir, before I started, there's a difference between min b'mino. Min b'mino, ta'am is not relevant, because if it was meat and meat, you wouldn't be able to taste one and the other. And the fact that they're going to start relating to the issue of taste, it's going to be obvious that they think it's two different types. So you could have a meal offering that became notar, it's left over beyond its time, and you could have meat that was pigul, or the reverse, doesn't matter. You have these two things that got mixed up together. Shebalalan zebazeva achalan, and you start eating them at the same time. Okay, this isn't like you're not sure which is pigul, which is notar. That's not the issue. The issue is that you're eating them at the same time. So in your mouth, let's say you start chewing. Let's say you have altogether a kazayit of this and a kazayit of that. Okay, so theoretically, if you eat a kazayit of notar, you're chayav karet. If you eat a kazayit of pigul, you're chayav karet. The issue is that you start chewing them at the same time. Now, in every chew, okay, when you eat, let's say you have a kazayit all together, but it's a combination of pigul and notar. And by laws of just whatever we would assume would be true, every bite you take or every mouthful that you're eating, you're going to have an imbalanced combination of pigul and notar. Right? It's going to be impossible to say that you had exactly 50% of this and 50% of that. So now, if you're eating pigul and notar, and you're eating, let's say, a kazayit of food, Mixed up in that kazayit is some pigul and some notar. But it's either going to be majority pigul, which is going to override the notar and nullify the notar of it, or majority of notar, which will nullify the pigul. Because of that, he says, patur, you're not going to be chayav karet, because you're not going to end up with a kazayit of isser. Why? Well, because basically each one is going to overpower the other and nullify it. And then you're not going to end up with a kazayit of either one of them or maybe one of them, but you don't know which one. So what is this all based on? Okay, I'm going to continue in the Gemara, even though we haven't fully explained it, because what the Gemara is going to do is one of those classic shma min atlat. We can infer 3 rulings from Rish Lakish, 3 principles, 3 laws, whatever you want to call them. We can infer 3 things from Rish Lakish. Shma mina, isurim mevatlim ze et ze. Now you might have thought maybe only heter cancels isser. Okay, like 2 different things. It's kind of the same thing as min be'emino mino. 2 things, one can overpower the other. But maybe 2 things that are the same kind of combine and you end up with, right? Maybe they can't overpower the other. But obviously here, pigul cancels the notar and notar cancels the pigul. Whichever one is the majority and what you're eating nullifies the other part. So isser can be mevatel isser. Ushma mina, notain tam berov lav deoraita. Now, this is based on, and this is where we assume, we're talking about there's taste involved here. One is imparting flavor to the other. So that means that if while I'm eating this combination of meal offering and meat, and let's say the meal offering we said was the notar and the meat was the pigul, again, it could be the reverse, but I could say that. Now, when I'm eating, if I happen to be eating, let's say majority pigul, I still taste the notar. So theoretically, the notar shouldn't be nullified, which means in the end, when I've eaten these 2 kazayits, I've eaten a kazayit of notar. But Rish Lakish says you're not chayav a notar. Why? Because the pigul nullified it, and it's as if you didn't eat it, even though it gave flavor. So what do you see here? That this law of notain tam, that again, like milk falls into chulin. If you have 2 drops in 60, it's going to be forbidden. If you only have 1 drop of milk in 60 against it, it'll be permitted. That must be a derabbanan law. Now again, remember, this is this is saying if it's nullified, right, then here, well, it's not, here we're going to say you're not then liable for eating notar, okay? You won't get karet for eating notar because it was nullified. And the fact that it had taste didn't mean, oh, it's not nullified because you can taste it. We don't care about taste on a Torah level, because to get the karet punishment, right, you would need a kazayit, and here it's nullified. Okay, but again, if we said tam was deoraita, we would say, oh, the notar is not nullified because you taste it. So because you tasted it, it's not nullified, and then you would have a full kazayit of notar and a full kazayit of pigul because you taste both in each combo, and you would end up with a kazayit of each. And the third, which maybe you had a question about this and you were trying to figure this out, this kind of completes the whole understanding of Rish Lakish. Ushma mina hatra'at safek lo shma hatra'a. What's the problem with this whole thing? Because in the end, you either ate a kazayit of notar or you ate a kazayit of pigul, right? In other words, one canceled the other in each mouthful, or maybe. But since we don't know which one, when you're chewing, right, which is the majority of what you're eating and which is the minority, so we don't know which one in the end you're really going to eat a kazayit of, okay? Or maybe in the end you won't even get to a side of each. But the point is, we can't warn you about it because that's called a hatrat safek. What are they going to warn you? Well, while you're eating this, you might eat a kazayit of notar, you might eat a kazayit of pigul, and if you ate the notar, you're going to be obligated, right? If the pigul got nullified, so you'll be obligated the notar, and if the notar got nullified, you'll be obligated the pigul. That's not a valid warning. You might remember that we learned this debate about whether this is valid or not, but this seems to indicate that, at least according to Rish Lakish, it's not a valid warning. Okay. Now, the only real thing that's going to interest us in this sugya right now is the middle shma mina, which is this notain tam berov lav deoraita. So why are we going to go about this? Because we're going to now raise a difficulty on this assumption from Rava, and we're going to have to reinterpret the case that it's not two of different things, but it's actually two of the same, and that we really don't infer this from Rish Lakish at all. So our Shema Minat Tlat is going to turn into a Shema Minat Trei. We only learn two things and not three things. So let's see the difficulty, and then we'll see how they try to resolve it. They don't manage to resolve it that way, but they do bring a resolution. We reject the resolution, and then we're going to have to reject this whole Shema Minat altogether. The second one, Mativ Rava. Asa Isa, we're bringing a Mishna from Challah. Okay? When you're obligated to take Challah from a dough, which is obviously a Torah law. Asa Isa min achitim u'min ha'orez. If you made a dough from grains, from wheat, and from rice. Now rice, you're not obligated in Challah, and wheat, you are. So im yesh ba ta'am dagan, if it tastes like, here you see taste is what determines, if it tastes like the wheat, chayev b'challah, then you're obligated in Challah. Okay, the wheat, right, in this case it was wheat, but it could be any of the 5 grains, which orez is not one of them, right? Rice is not one of the 5 grains. Afagav deruba orez. So now they say the following. You're chayav in Challah, even if the majority of the dough is rice flour. It doesn't matter, because if you taste the wheat, you're obligated. So that looks like, right, you have 2 different things. You're going to be chayav by Torah law for Challah. Even though there's no majority, there's taste. Looks like taste is Torah law against what we infer from Rish Lakish. To which they answer, Midrabanan. What do you mean? Maybe you're only chayav Challah on a rabbinic level. That would be a good way to resolve it. But the Gemara says that doesn't fit with the rest of the Mishnah. Ihachi ema seifa. Look at the end of that Mishnah. Adam yotzei ba yidei chovato b'Pesach. You can eat matzah. This is fascinating halacha. That's majority made of rice, which is obviously not matzah. Matzah has to be made from one of the 5 grains. So you can eat matzah that's made majority rice flour, a small minority of wheat flour, but if it tastes like wheat, you can be yotzei the din of matzah. Okay, well, and that we're not talking about that, it's kosher matzah. We're talking about that it's matzah you can fulfill your mitzvah on the night of Pesach with. That's what it means yotzei yidei chovato b'Pesach. Okay, the mitzvah of matzah on the first night, which is a big mitzvah, you can be yotzei here. Now, according to only if you're Sephardi. That's a whole later. The whole kiddiyot is much later. That did not exist in the time of the Gemara or Mishna. This is a Mishnah. There was an outlier opinion, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that did think, but he actually thinks rice is it's okay. I don't want to get out of this whole thing. If you think rice is forbidden, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, then you actually think rice could be used as your matzah, because he thinks it's like part of the whole thing. That's a whole different thing, but our kiddiyot, the way we understand them today, is not based on that, and it's a totally later addition. So now, the point being that according to this, for sure, ta'am is Torah law, because if ta'am wasn't Torah law, again, this is why I said, ta'am is good and bad, right? Notain ta'am, often we think it's bad, because if your milk is tasted in the chulent, you can't eat the chulent. But in this case, you can actually fulfill your mitzvah of Pesach by having enough in there that you feel right, that you can taste the grain part of it. That's enough to be yotzei your mitzvah. So you see, the ta'am is actually a Torah law. So what we said about Rish Lakish, the ta'am's not a Torah law, and that's why the pigul can override the notar, or the notar can override the pigul, even though you taste it, can't really be true. So we're going to have to assume that the pigul in the notar case that Rish Lakish was talking about was 2 of the same items, meat, and not meat and meal offering, and that we don't infer that ta'am is only rabbinic, but ta'am really is a Torah law, like we just proved. And therefore, we're going to say like this, turning to the top of Amud Bet, Elamim b'she'eno mino b'ta'ama. If it's 2 different items, that's when ta'am is a factor, because again, you would taste the difference. B'mim b'mino b'ruba. But if it's 2 of the same items, then it's nullified in a majority. And that explains Rish Lakish. Because Rish Lakish was talking about 2 pieces of meat, same item. There is no taste. It's not a relevant factor. Because you're eating meat, it tastes the same, whether it's notar or pigul. And therefore, it's going to be nullified in a rove. And that's why you're not obligated karet. Okay, we can end the sugya here, but we're going to complicate the sugya a little bit more. Because now, why did we bring this whole sugya? I told you this is a complete different sugya. but we're bringing it because of our Mishnah. Now, what did our Mishnah do? Let's just learn it outside for a minute before we read it inside. If we assume, which is a reasonable assumption, which is definitely what the Gemara assumes here, that ta'am and mar'eh, appearance, are the same. Again, what did our Mishnah say? Appearance means it's not going to be nullified in rove. The blood is still going to be considered blood, even if it's a minority, if it looks like blood, right? Blood in water, let's say. So it still is going to be blood if it looks like blood. Just like the bread, the matzah, is still going to be matzah, even if it tastes like, right? Even if the majority is rice, because it tastes like the wheat, it's going to be called matzah. So that's the same idea. But look what our Mishnah did. Our Mishnah took, the water and the blood works perfectly, min b'she'eno mino. But our Mishnah also discussed blood with wine, which is kind of the same because they look the same, and blood with blood, which is exactly the same, and still said that what? It said, view the wine as if it's water, right? Which basically meant look at min b'mino as if it's min b'she'eno mino, and then assess, would it still have the appearance of blood? If so, you're good. If not, you're not. So it basically took min b'mino and said, well, look at min b'mino as if it's min b'she'eno mino. So how could you say there's a distinction between min b'mino and min b'she'eno mino b'tam when basically the Mishnah said, okay, we're going to read it now, v'nisha'er min b'mino kimin b'she'eno mino. Why don't we look at min b'mino as if it's min b'she'eno mino? Why don't we look at these two pieces of meat and say, look, was there enough notar mixed up with the pigul that if you had switched the notar for a meal offering, you would have tasted it? And if the answer is yes, then it's still there and it can't be nullified. And then you'll be chayiv karet, because in the end, you ate pigul and you ate notar, and neither of them were nullified, and you ate a kazayit of each. So that's the question. And why is that? And that question is based on our Mishnah. As it says in our Mishnah, ditnan. Nitarev b'yayin, ro'ino toki'ilu humayim. So, right, if the blood gets mixed up with wine, we look at it as if it's water, and we assess. What would it be if it were min b'eino mino? My lav, right? Is it not to be explained the way we explained it? Ro'ino to liyayin ki'ilu humayim. We look at the wine as if it's water, and then we make an assessment. Does it look like water, or would it look like water, or would it look like blood? So to answer this question, even though this isn't really going to work, but they're going to try, they're going to flip the case in the Mishnah. Lo. It's not we look at the wine, was the wine like water? We actually take the blood itself and say we look at it as if it was water. Now, what does this do? It's a little confusing to think about, but what this does is it basically means that if the blood were water and it would look like water, which basically means that the majority, you would need the majority to be blood in order for it to be blood. And in order to allow it on the altar, we'd be much less lenient here. Okay? We wouldn't allow it just because it looks, right? Just because if you take the wine and you turn it into water, right, then we say, does that overpower the blood or not? But here, we're basically saying if it's the blood you're turning into water, then what you're basically saying is if the majority is blood, then it's blood. If it's not, it's overpowered. And that's bim bimino, birov. And then that fits perfectly with Rish Lakish. And then we've resolved our issue. But the Gemara doesn't like that resolution because the Gemara says, Ihachi batel mebayele. If we're basically saying we look at the blood like it's water, and then if it's, which basically is synonymous with, if it's the majority, then you can use it. And if not, it's nullified. Then the Mishnah should have used the language of batel mebayele. It should have said, and if it looks like water, it's nullified. Okay? We view it as if it's water, and if it looks like water, it's nullified, and never uses the language of nullified in the Mishnah. So the language doesn't work, but more than that, the Od Tanya, it says in actually the Tosefta, it says, Rabbi Yehuda Omil, Ro'ino Toki'ilu, okay, before we read this inside, I'll explain. Actually, this isn't the Tosefta. No, this is the Tosefta. We're going to see two cases with a mikvah. Okay, we're now moving from blood to mikvah, and basically what's white is red and red is white. We're going to just, okay, in the mikvah, you want everything to be white and clear. In the blood, you want it all to be red, right? So now we're going to have white wine mixed in a mikvah. Okay, like we have red wine mixed up with the blood, and then we view the red wine as if it was white wine, right? White. And then we said, or water. So now we're going to do the reverse. We're going to be in a mikvah, and we have a mikvah that's kosher mikvah, but then what happens is, right, something goes into the mikvah. We're going to see in a minute that it's a pail falls in with white wine in it or milk. And we want to know, is this liquid that's in there now, is it going to be, first of all, is it a chatzitza? Is it create like a barrier because there's something foreign substance in the vessel that's now in the mikvah? And also, is it nullified into the mikvah? So we say like this. Rabbi Yehuda says, again, employing this concept of we look at the wine that fell in or the milk that fell in as if it's red wine. And imdiha mareu kashil. If it would keep it light still, it wouldn't make it darker, then it's fine. Imdiha mareu. If it kept the look of it still pale, it would be fine. Im lav pasul. If not, it's disqualified. Now again, what did we do here? And this is the big problem. Because if you want to say that Rish Lakish was really talking about, we look at the blood as if it's water. So we have two issues really, or you could put it like this. If you compare the two cases, we have the mikvah's like the blood, and the wine that goes in, right, is like the wine that goes in there, the wine in the wine. And which one are we changing? We're not saying we look at the mikvah waters as if it was red wine, right? Just like they tried to say we look at the blood as if it was water. No, it's the item that fell into it that we're looking at, okay? That's first of all. And second of all, it's very clear here that mar'eh, right? We do the exact same thing. With this whole suggestion, they said, nishe'er min b'mino kimin she'eno mino. We basically view an item with two of the same substances, right? Water and white wine, which again is the same because the color is the same, and water and milk, even though, right, not exactly the same color, but similar enough. And we view them as if we say, oh, well, let's view that in the world as if they're two different types. And that completely goes against what Rish Lakish said, or what we inferred from Rish Lakish. So to answer this question, they're going to basically simply say, Tanaihi, there's a machloket Tanaim. Okay? And it's going to break down into Rabbi Yehuda matches our Mishna, because remember, we asked against Rish Lakish from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah did that. Min b'mino b'she'eno mino. We tried to maybe answer it in a way that's not really what they're doing. But it wasn't a really good answer, and Rabbi Yehuda says exactly the same thing. So we're basically going to say that Rabbi Yehuda matches our Mishnah, and Rish Lakish matches Tanakama's position. And that we're going to see right now in the whole Tosefta. They just quoted us part of the Tosefta. But the whole Tosefta is like this. Ditanya. So you have a pail, here's the whole case, with white wine or milk, vihit below, and you put it in the mikvah, holchim achar harov. We follow the majority. That's perfect. That's Rish Lakish. Min bimino birov. Right? Two of the same items. Taste doesn't matter. In this case, it's not taste, it's appearance. Appearance doesn't matter. What it looks like doesn't matter. We go by rov. If the mikvah waters are more than the wine that came in, then the mikvah waters basically nullify the white wine. It's not viewed as a chatzitza. It's not viewed as a problem in this mikvah. Everything's fine. But if the white wine is more than the mikvah, then it's a problem. Rabbi Yehuda omer lo inoto ki'iluhu yayin adom im dihamareu kasher v'im lav pasul. And there's the other position of Rabbi Yehuda. So to answer again, what we did in this entire sugya, okay, and we'll kind of summarize the whole daf before we start the next section, which really goes into tomorrow's daf, and is mostly not part. I mean, it's an outgrowth of this, but it's an aside. So let me get you the whole structure of today's daf first. We started with a Mishnah, right? Which again, we focused right now on the beginning part of the Mishnah about the dam that got mixed up with water, which is obviously a min b'she'eno we know and goes by appearance. But then it also had blood that got mixed up with red wine and blood that gets mixed up with other blood. And then we say it all depends on, right, the appearance, which is strange because it's min b'mino, which in the end we proved that according to Rish Lakish, min b'mino goes by rov, not by appearance or not by taste, which was the same as appearance. And that seems to contradict, to which in the end we're going to say two different opinions. So again, going through the whole Gemara, the Gemara, we started with limiting this law of the Mishnah to blood, having water going into blood, wine going into blood, other bloods going into the blood that needs to go on the altar. But if the blood fell into the other mixtures, it would be Rishon Batel, Dachoy, and that wouldn't be accepted. And that's just different from Kisoy Adam, which is a mitzvah, and there's no Dichoy rejection issues by mitzvot. Only by sanctified items going or being offered to God as a sacrifice or as an offering. Then we brought this halacha of Rish Lakish. We inferred three things, thinking he was talking about two different types of things. In the end, we said, oh no, the pigel and the notar are the same. They're both meat, and that's why one nullifies the other. Okay, because in mim b'mino, it goes by rov, whereas mim b'she'eno mino, if there's taste, it's actually not nullified. But that can't be what Rish Lakish is talking about, because then it actually, you'd be obligated in pigel or notar. So that's how in the end we we had three inferences, Isser Mevatel Isser. We thought Noten Tam Berov is not Torah, but since we couldn't prove that, we had to reinterpret Rish Lakish. And since we proved that was not true from the Chala case, so we had to undo that and explain Rish Lakish differently. And this Hatra'at Safek is not a Hatra'ah. From there, we raised a difficulty, but why would Rish Lakish say Mim B'mino Berov when we have our Mishnah that says we view Mim B'mino like Mim B'she'eno Mino, and it goes by appearance, which again is the same as Ta'am and not Rov. And in the end, we said, right, we tried to resolve it by saying maybe we read the Mishnah differently. Maybe it really is Rov by switching which one we do the rowing to. But that didn't make sense with the language of the Mishnah, and it also contradicted Rabbi Yehuda's position. So in the end, we basically say, it's a machloket tanaim. Rabbi Yehuda represents one position, which is like the one in our Mishnah, and Rish Lakish follows the opinion of Tanna Kama. Now we're going to ask a difficulty on Rabbi Yehuda and his position from a Braita, and from a Mishnah in Mikvaot. And here goes, Uraminhi. So we're going to just ask the contradiction today, and we'll resolve it in a bunch of ways tomorrow. Delishuhu malei rukin vihitbilo. Okay, we're going to have to show. There's three cases here. We're going to use case 2 to prove that this is Rabbi Yehuda, because it doesn't say Rabbi Yehuda in this Mishnah, but we're going to prove that it's Rabbi Yehuda. And then we're going to say case 3 actually contradicts the principle of Rabbi Yehuda, that when you have Mim B'mino, he goes by appearance. You view it as if it's Mim B'she'eno Mino and follows appearance. But that's not what he says here. Here he says Rov, and that's going to be the contradiction. So the first case is not really relevant, but it's just the beginning of the Mishnah, and it builds up. Tilishu malei rukin vit bilo. So again, we have a pail that we want to tovel in the mikvah, like the previous one, and it's full of a substance. So we're going to have 3 different substances. Okay, they're all going to be clear substances, somewhat, but each one has a different rule. If it's full of saliva is kind of thick, okay, because of that, ki'ilu lo taval, okay? Because that's a thick substance, and that is a chatzitza, which is an interposition. There's something blocking the kli from having the waters get into it, because it has this thick substance in it. That doesn't work. And we're not going to say, okay, now here comes in this whole issue of what we call hashaka. The way we make a kosher mikveh is, right, you need to have a certain amount of kosher mikveh waters, which are not collected, and there's all different rules about what can be a mikveh water. But if it's touching other waters that can't necessarily be mikveh waters, often the water, by touching the other waters, it creates, it like makes it okay, even though normally they can't be used, but we can use it's called hashaka. So if you have, so the rok doesn't work for that. You can't say hashaka works and kind of uses, that water becomes part of the mikveh and it works. But me raglaim, if you have urine, I know this sounds a little disgusting, but if you have urine, ro'ino to ki'ilu heim mayim. That is a more thin substance. It's more similar to water, and we can view the urine as if it's water, and therefore it becomes like regular waters that normally aren't necessarily used for a mikvah. Let's say it was water collected, but with hashaka, with touching, as soon as they touch, because as soon as you put it in, the waters touch the water, it becomes part of the mikvah. Now, the third case is malei mechata. But if you put in mechata, which is paraduma waters, and Rashi says it, because they're an avatuma, if you remember, the paraduma waters cause whoever touches them, who's sprinkling them, to become impure. It's that weird thing about paraduma. It purifies the person you sprinkle on, but the person who touches them actually becomes impure. So they're an avatuma v'chashive mishum kdushatayu. and they're also significant because of their kedusha. Lo batle ela beruba. They're only going to be nullified berov, and that's why the Mishnah says here, and that Rashi was just explaining this Mishnah. Malei mechatat ad shirbu hamayim al mechatat. Those are not nullified, and they're going to be a chatzitza, an interposition here between those that kli and the water, and we can't say, oh, the mikveh waters just turn it into other mikveh waters like we did with the urine, because it has this significance on its own, because of its sanctity and because it's an avatuma. Both of those put in the category of something important that can't be batel. Is batel berov, but it won't be batel for, won't work to do hashaka with it. So now, first we have to prove this is Rabbi Yehuda's position, and then we have to show what the problem is. So we're going to do that right now, and with that we'll finish. Man shamat leidi leroin, Rabbi Yehuda. The middle position there said we view the urine as if it's water. Now, who uses this principle of we view it as if, meaning it's not water, but we can view it as if it's water, okay? Before, we took the wine and we said we view it as if it's water, right? Now, this is a very different use of it, but, okay, because here we're viewing it to say it's the same thing. There we had to say we view it as if it's something different. But it's using this principle of rowing. That's Rabbi Yehuda. So we assume this Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda's position. Vikatane, and it says, disagele beruba. And in the end of the Mishnah, it says, min bimino, mechatat in water. It's batel berov. And we don't say, go by appearance, view the mechatat as if it's a different substance. Do you still view it there, right? Theoretically, you would say, if it's not batel, right, and you need rov, maybe you need even more than rov. Maybe if it were to change color and you would still see it, you would make it red, it would. So it just doesn't seem, right, it goes against what we said Rabbi Yehuda says. So we're going to leave this contradiction, and tomorrow we're going to see different ways to resolve the contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda's words. So that's it for today. We did the summary already. This last part was just raising a contradiction on Rabbi Yehuda that we got to, again, Rish Lakish. From there we brought in our Mishnah as a difficulty to what we assessed about what we said Rabbi Lakish says. We brought in Rabbi Yehuda to support the question. Also, Rabbi Yehuda and the Mishnah both supported this question against Rish Lakish, to which we said those two are on one side, Rish Lakish is on the other side with the Tanakama of that Tosefta, and with that we now went off about this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and trying to resolve some contradiction in what he says. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.